My name is Maya Ferris. I'm 29, and 11 days before my wedding, my fiancé canceled it with a text message that was 4 sentences long. I read it standing in my kitchen with a spoon still in a jar of peanut butter, and I remember thinking the strangest thing, that the message was too short for what it was doing to my life. I can't do this. I need space. Please don't call the venue. I'm sorry. That was it. No call, no warning. 11 days. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there rereading it, waiting for a 5th sentence that never came. Then, less than an hour later, my phone rang, and it was his mother, Carol, and she was crying so hard I almost didn't recognize her voice. Where are you right now, watching or listening to this? Because I want you to sit with that moment for a second, the way I had to. Your fiancé cancels your wedding by text, and before you've even had time to fall apart, his own mother is calling you in tears. Not him, her. I picked up because some part of me thought maybe she was calling to apologize on his behalf, to soften it, to explain that he was going through something private, and this wasn't really about me. That is not what happened. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the shape of the year before it. I'm an occupational therapist. I work with kids who have sensory processing differences, mostly ages 4 to 11, in a clinic outside Dayton. It's steady work, not glamorous, but I'm good at it, and I like that my days have a rhythm I can control. Daniel Callahan did not have that kind of life. His family owns Callahan Development, a mid-sized construction and land company his grandfather started, and Daniel worked under his father, Richard, doing project management on residential builds. When I met Daniel, he was easy to talk to, funny in a low-key way, and seemed almost embarrassed by how much money moved through his family's business. He used to joke that he was furniture in his own company, meaning his father made every real decision, and Daniel just executed them. We dated for 2 years, got engaged at 14 months. In the beginning, Richard was warm to me, almost performatively so. He'd bring up my job at dinners like it mattered to him, ask about specific kids I worked with, remember their names. Carol was quieter, kinder in a smaller way, the kind of woman who notices when your glass is empty before you do. I liked her. I want to say that clearly because what happened later complicates that, but it doesn't erase it. The shift started around 5 months before the wedding, though I didn't clock it as a shift at the time. Daniel began working later. He stopped mentioning specific projects by name, which he used to do constantly. I could have told you the square footage of 3 subdivisions he was managing. Now it was just work stuff. He started taking calls in another room. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd say he was tired, that his father was riding him hard about a new deal, and I believed him. Because Richard riding people hard was not new information. About 10 weeks out, our wedding planner, Denise, called me with a strange question. She asked if we'd added a second event to our contract with the venue, because she'd seen a deposit go through for a corporate function the same weekend, under Callahan Development's name, at the same property. I told her that made no sense. We only had the one date booked. She said she'd look into it and get back to me. She never fully explained it then. I let it go. I had seating charts to finish. 7 weeks out, Daniel's sister Ashley texted me out of nowhere, just to ask how I was doing, which wasn't like her. We were friendly but not close, the kind of future in-laws who exchange holiday texts and little else. I told her I was drowning in favors and florist emails. She said something odd. She said, just, however things go, none of it was your fault. I asked what she meant. She said she'd said too much already, and to forget it. I did not forget it. I just didn't know what to do with it. 6 weeks out, I noticed Daniel had started leaving his phone face down on every surface, which he had never done before. Not even in the early months when I might have had a reason to wonder about him. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself I didn't want to be the kind of fiancé who monitored a phone. Looking back, I think what I actually didn't want was to find something I couldn't unsee 11 days before I stood in a dress in front of 140 people. 5 weeks out, we had a fight, small and forgettable at the time, about the seating chart. I wanted his cousin's table moved away from the open bar because his cousin has a documented habit of over-serving himself at family events. Daniel got strangely defensive, said his father wanted that side of the room arranged a specific way for optics, and when I asked what optics had to do with a seating chart, he said never mind and dropped it. I remember thinking it was odd that his father had opinions about our seating chart at all. I filed it under wedding stress and moved on, the way you file away a dozen small oddities that only make sense once you have the missing piece. 4 weeks out, Richard invited Daniel and me to dinner alone, without Carol, which had never happened before. He spent the whole meal talking about a land deal with a company called Whitmore Development, a much bigger regional developer that Callahan had been trying to partner with for 3 years. He kept saying things like, this was the deal that changed everything for the family, and that our future children could inherit something real if it went through. He asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd ever considered stepping back from clinic work once things settled, a question that struck me as strange coming from a man who had spent 2 years praising my career at every dinner we'd shared. I thought he was talking in general terms about legacy. I didn't think he was talking about me at all, or more precisely, about replacing me. 3 weeks out, Daniel canceled a Sunday we'd set aside months earlier to do our final walkthrough with the caterer, saying work had blown up unexpectedly. I did the walkthrough alone. The catering coordinator, a woman named Priya who had clearly done this 100 times, mentioned in passing that the venue's events team had been unusually busy lately with what she called overflow bookings from the same corporate account. I asked which account. She didn't know off the top of her head and said she'd check. She never got back to me, and I never followed up, because 2 days later, I was buried in RSVP logistics and it slipped my mind entirely. I think about that conversation constantly now, how close I came to the answer 3 weeks before I actually got it. 11 days out, the text came. And then Carol called. She wasn't calling to comfort me. She was calling because she couldn't hold what she knew inside her body anymore, and I happened to be the person on the other end of the line when it broke loose. She told me that 4 days earlier, she had gone looking for a folder of tax documents in Richard's home office and found, instead, a draft partnership agreement between Callahan Development and Whitmore Development. She said most of it was the kind of language she didn't understand, contingencies and equity splits, but there was a clause near the end that she read 3 times because she thought she'd misunderstood it. The merger was structured to include what the document called a family alignment provision, a reduced buy-in cost for Callahan Development contingent on a marriage between the 2 families within the calendar year. Richard's old college friend, Ted Whitmore, had a daughter, Paige, recently divorced, and the provision named her, specifically, as the qualifying party. I asked Carol to say that again slower. She did. It didn't get less strange the second time. She said she confronted Richard that same night, and he didn't deny it. He told her it wasn't as cold as it sounded, that Daniel and Paige had actually met twice already at his arrangement, framed as networking dinners, and that Daniel had agreed, reluctantly, because the company was carrying debt from a stalled project and this merger would clear it. Carol said Richard's exact words were, "Nobody's forcing anyone. Daniel's a grown man. He made his choice." She said she'd been sick to her stomach for 4 days, hadn't slept, and finally decided I deserved to know the truth, even if it destroyed her marriage, to tell me. I sat down on my kitchen floor while she talked. I remember the tile was cold through my jeans and I didn't move. Have you ever had a moment where a dozen small, confusing details from months earlier suddenly line up into one picture you didn't want to see? That's what this was. The late nights. The second event booked at our venue, which I now understood was likely a Whitmore dinner, scheduled quietly in case ours fell through. Ashley's strange comment, Richard's dinner about legacy. None of it had been random. It had been a slow, deliberate unwinding that I mistook for wedding stress. Carol kept apologizing, saying she should have looked sooner, should have asked more questions, should have protected me the way she'd have wanted someone to protect her own daughter. I told her it wasn't her fault, though at that point I wasn't sure I believed it. I asked her one direct question: did Daniel know, when we set our wedding date, that this provision existed? She said she didn't know for certain, but she believed he'd known for at least 2 months, because that's roughly when the networking dinners with Paige started. 2 months. We had cake tastings 2 months ago. We picked out our first dance song 2 months ago. I remember standing in a florist's back room, holding 2 ribbon samples up to the light, asking Daniel which one he liked better, and he'd said either was fine. He trusted my judgment. At the time, I took that as ease between us. Now I wonder if it was distance dressed up as trust. A man already halfway out of a decision he no longer felt he had the right to weigh in on. I asked Carol how she'd managed to sit across from me the cake tasting 3 weeks earlier, knowing what she'd already begun to suspect. Even before she found the document itself, she said she hadn't known anything concrete yet at that point, only a low, persistent unease she kept talking herself out of, the kind of feeling mothers apparently learn to distrust in themselves because acting on it too often makes you the difficult one in the room. She said she wished she'd trusted that unease 3 weeks sooner. I told her one understood exactly what that felt like, because I'd been doing the same thing with a dozen smaller signs for months. I didn't call Daniel that night. I couldn't make my hands work well enough to type anything that wasn't going to come out as something I'd regret. Instead, I called Denise, the wedding planner, and asked her directly what she'd found out about that second booking. She admitted she'd been holding back because she wasn't sure it was her place, but she confirmed that Callahan Development had reserved the same venue for a private dinner exactly 9 days after our original date, which would have been days after our honeymoon was supposed to end. The event listing, forwarded from the venue's internal calendar, named the guest of honor as Paige Whitmore. That was the moment suspicion became something closer to proof. Not full proof, but enough that I stopped doubting my own read of the situation. Denise offered to send me the forwarded calendar entry itself, said she'd kept it because something about the timing had bothered her too, and when it landed in my inbox that night, I read the guest of honor line 4 or 5 times. The way you reread a diagnosis, to make sure the letters aren't going to rearrange themselves into something kinder. The next 4 days were the strangest of my life because I had to keep functioning. I still had 8 kids on my caseload who needed me steady and calm in session, and somehow I found a version of myself who could do that for 45-minute blocks and then fall apart in my car in the clinic parking lot in between them. My mother came and stayed with me. My sister canceled 2 days of work to sit with me while I made calls, to the venue about our contract, to the caterer, to the string quartet we'd booked. Unwinding 100 small commitments one by one, each cancellation its own quiet humiliation. Daniel texted twice more in that stretch. Once to ask if I'd told anyone yet, which told me exactly what he was actually worried about. Once to say he was sorry it had to happen this way, as if the method was the problem and not the reason. I didn't respond to either. On the 5th day, Ashley called me, not texted, called, and this time she didn't hold back. She told me she'd tried to warn me weeks earlier and hated herself for not saying more. She said Daniel had come to her crying the night before he sent the text, saying he felt trapped, that their father had been floating the merger idea since spring, framing it as temporary strategic positioning, and that Daniel kept telling himself it would fall through on its own, so he wouldn't have to be the one to end things with me. When the deal accelerated faster than he expected, he panicked and sent the text rather than face me. Ashley said she'd told him that was cowardice dressed up as strategy, and he hadn't spoken to her since. I asked Ashley why she was telling me all this now. She said because Carol had already broken the silence, and because she was tired of being the only person in that family who thought loyalty to Daniel didn't mean lying to me. I asked her one more thing, the question that had been sitting underneath every other question since the text arrived. I asked if Daniel had ever, even once, considered telling their father no. Ashley was quiet for a moment before she answered. She said their father didn't really give people room to say no, not directly. He restructured situations until saying no looked unreasonable, made refusal feel like ingratitude toward everything the family had built. She said Daniel had spent his whole adult life inside that pattern and didn't seem to know there was another way to exist in his own family. It didn't excuse what he did, it did explain, a little, why a grown man had chosen a 4-sentence text over a difficult phone call. Cowardice, I've come to think, usually has a shape and a history to it, even when it still lands on someone else as pure cruelty. I want to be honest about something. Even with all of this laid out, some small, humiliated part of me wondered if I'd missed obvious signs, if I should have pushed harder when he got quiet, if 2 years should have taught me to read him better. I think that's a normal thing to feel, and also a trap, because the truth is, people who are planning to leave you for a business arrangement don't usually announce it. They let you keep booking flowers. Here's what actually happened next, and it's less dramatic than you might expect, because real consequences almost always are. My family owns a small excavation and grading company that does subcontract work for several regional developers, including, as it turned out, 2 projects that had previously used Callahan Development as their general contractor. My father wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking at a business relationship differently once he understood how Callahan operated internally. When I told my parents what Carol had shared, my father made exactly 1 phone call to the project manager he'd worked with directly for years, not to spread gossip, but to say he had concerns about Callahan's reliability going forward, given what he now knew about how family and business decisions were being blended at the top. He didn't need to say more than that. Word moves fast in a small regional industry. And within 3 weeks, Callahan Development had lost a maintenance subcontract renewal that my father's company had quietly recommended for years. It wasn't a massive loss. It was a real one, Richard noticed. Separately, the venue held firm on our contract's cancellation clause, which specified that the party initiating cancellation forfeited the deposit. And because the text canceling the wedding had come from Daniel's number, referencing our wedding, the venue counted it as cancellation by the paying party of record, which happened to be split between my parents and Daniel's, per the original invoice. Daniel's family ended up owing more of that forfeited amount than mine did, a detail that felt less like justice and more like paperwork finally landing where it belonged. The bigger reckoning was quieter than either of those. Carol moved out of the house in early spring, not permanently at first, staying with her sister 2 towns over, but it became permanent by summer. She told me once, in a message I didn't expect and almost didn't open, that finding that document had cracked something in her that she'd been ignoring for 20 years. The way Richard treated people, including his own children, as instruments of the company's growth. She said, watching me on the other end of that phone call, hearing herself say those sentences out loud to a stranger who didn't deserve any of it, was the moment she understood she couldn't stay married to how he did business. I don't know the whole shape of their separation. I know she was the only person in that family who chose honesty over protecting the family name, and it cost her almost everything comfortable in her life to do it. Daniel did not marry Paige Whitmore. From what Ashley told me later, the merger stalled anyway, for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them personally. Whitmore Development pulled back after a due diligence review flagged Callahan's debt load as riskier than they'd been told. So the marriage that was supposed to save the company never even needed to happen, and Daniel had ended things with me for a deal that collapsed under its own weight 3 months later. I found out through Ashley, not through him. He never called me directly. He sent 1 more message, months after the wedding date had passed, saying he hoped I was doing okay and that he was sorry for how it ended. I didn't answer that one either. Some apologies arrive too late to be for the other person. They're for the person sending them. I moved. Not far, just to a different part of the same county. A small rental with a porch I can actually sit on, because I decided somewhere in that spring that I wanted a life that felt like mine again, uncomplicated by anyone else's family strategy. I kept working with my kids. A boy named Owen, one of my long-term clients, drew me a picture that spring of what he called a strong castle, all thick lines and a moat, and told me, castles need walls so the right things can get in and the wrong things can't. I taped it to my fridge. I still have it. I've thought a lot about what I'd say to someone sitting where I sat on that kitchen floor. I don't think the lesson is to distrust people faster or to build walls before you need them. I think the lesson is that the people who tell you the truth, even late, even at a cost to themselves, are worth more than the ones who protect a comfortable silence. Carol lost her marriage telling me something true. Richard lost a contract protecting a lie. Daniel lost both a deal and a person who loved him, trying to avoid one hard conversation. I still don't fully know how to feel about Carol. Grateful isn't a big enough word, but it also doesn't erase how long she stayed quiet before she couldn't anymore. I've decided I don't have to resolve that feeling into something simpler than it is. If you've ever found out the real reason behind something that hurt you, months or years after the fact, I'd like to know how you carried it. Whether it made the pain worse or somehow easier to finally understand. I think mine got both harder and lighter at the same time, which doesn't make sense until it happens to you. I didn't get married that year. I got something else instead. A clearer sense of what silence costs the people who keep it, and what it gives back to the ones who finally break it. I'll take that trade, even now, even after everything it took to get here. There's a part of this I haven't said out loud to many people, which is what those first few nights alone actually looked like, after the calls stopped and the practical unwinding was mostly done, and it was just me in an apartment full of wedding boxes I didn't know what to do with. I'd bought a set of white candles for the reception tables, 40 of them, sitting in a closet still wrapped in plastic. I didn't throw them out for months. I'd open that closet looking for something else entirely, and there they'd be, and I'd just close the door again. Eventually my sister came over on a Saturday and we lit every single one in my living room at once, no ceremony to it, just enough light to fill the whole apartment, and then we blew them out together and put the leftover wax stubs in a shoebox. I don't know why that helped. It did. I also want to be fair to Daniel in one specific way, because it would be easy to flatten him into a villain, and I don't think that's accurate. Ashley told me, months later, that he'd started seeing a counselor on his own, unprompted by anyone, trying to understand why he'd let his father's version of what mattered override his own for as long as he had. I don't know if that's true or if it's the kind of thing families say to make an ending feel less bleak. Either way, it doesn't change what he did or how he did it. A person can be genuinely lost inside a family system and still owe the people he hurt an honest conversation instead of 4 sentences and silence. Growth, if it's real, doesn't erase what came before it. It just means the next relationship he's in might get the version of honesty I didn't. As for Richard, the first heard through the industry grapevine, the same channel that had carried the news of the lost subcontract, that Callahan Development eventually secured a smaller partnership with a different regional developer about a year later, on ordinary commercial terms, no family alignment clauses attached. Whether that came from genuine reflection on his part or simply because the earlier approach had cost him too much, I can't say, and honestly, it's not something I spend much time wondering about anymore. His decisions were never really mine to carry. What I carry instead is smaller and more useful. I carry the fact that Carol picked up a phone in the worst possible moment and chose to be honest with a woman she had every incentive to let quietly disappear from her son's life. I carry the fact that Ashley, who owed me nothing beyond politeness, decided politeness wasn't worth what it was costing me. I carry the version of myself who sat on a cold kitchen floor and didn't fall apart in a way I couldn't come back from, who kept showing up for 8 kids who needed a steady voice in the room even in the middle of the worst week of her life. Owen, the boy with the castle drawing, graduated out of my caseload eventually, the way kids do when they've built the skills they came in for. His mother told me on his last day that he still talks about walls sometimes, in his own way, when he's deciding who gets close and who doesn't. I think about that more than I probably should. Somewhere in a 4-year-old's crayon logic, there was something true that took me 29 years and 1 canceled wedding to actually learn for myself. That the point was never to keep everyone out. It was to know, clearly and calmly, who deserved a way in. So if you're listening to this and you've ever had the ground shift under you because someone chose comfort over honesty for months before they finally told you the truth, or maybe never told you at all and you had to find it some other way, I'd like to hear how long it took you to trust your own read of a situation again. Mine took the better part of a year. It came back anyway. I think it always does. Eventually, if you let the honest people in your life keep telling you the truth even when it's late, even when it costs them something to say it,